Okay, I think we're going to go ahead and get started. So I want to, hello everyone, and welcome to How to Plan a Backpacking Trip, Workshop 1. The purpose of this workshop is to provide some context and some tools so that you may plan your own backpacking trip and perhaps plan trips for the Austin Backpackers group. I'd like to make a disclaimer that this is not the only way to plan a backpacking trip. In reality, it's just my method, and there are many methods to plan, probably as many methods as there are trails. And so this is just my method. So I would encourage you to just take what you learned today and apply it to your own situation. If you have any comments or feedback, please send them to me, because I'm always learning, and I would like to improve my own knowledge and skills in terms of backpacking trip planning. Let's see. We are offering a second workshop on March 2nd, and they will offer the exact same content as this workshop. So there's no need to attend both workshops. We kind of have this workshop broken into two different parts, part 1 and part 2. We'll get into that a little bit later, but you only need to attend this one workshop. Basically, during the first half of this workshop, we'll be presenting some concepts and a checklist, which you should have received in the email that had the Zoom link. We'll also provide it at the end of the workshop, or maybe Victoria can provide it while the workshop's going on, but it's a checklist that we're going to be going through today. And then let's see, and this, so during the second part of the session, workshop, Victoria and I will actually demonstrate and create a trip plan and share it with you. And this will also be a trip plan that you can hike solo or that you can hike with a group. And if you have any questions during the presentation, please submit them via the chat, and we'll try to respond to them as they come up, or maybe at the end of each part. And at the very end of the workshop, we'll have a time where we just have open discussion, and you can air your grievances if you want. But beyond this introduction, I just want to introduce you to Victoria. So Victoria, do you just want to give a real brief introduction of yourself?
Yeah, hello everybody. My name is Victoria Flores. Some things about myself is I love to go hiking, kayaking, and I'm a beginner backpacker. And I'm excited to show you how to create a plan for your trips today. So yeah.
Yeah, and so she's being a little modest. She's an avid hiker, and she's also one of the new Texas Parks and Wildlife ambassadors. She just got into the program, so she'll be doing some training and then some, I think some community time or something like that. Yep. Out at Inks Lake, is that right?
Yep, at Inks Lake State Park. So yeah, I'm super excited.
If you're out there at Inks Lake, maybe look for her in the spring or in the summer. And then also, there's a number of other organizers in this meeting. I want to give a shout out to Frederick and Mark and Maya and I think Celeste and Elizabeth. And originally Elizabeth and I were going to plan to do this, but she kind of blew me off and said, nah, you and Victoria do it. But she is online, and Elizabeth, as many of you know, is very experienced. So she may chime in at different parts of the workshop. Okay. Other than that, let's go ahead and proceed to what we're going to cover tonight. So this is basically a checklist that I developed to help me go through my thought process as I'm planning a trip. And probably the most common question that people have when they're planning a trip is, well, where to go, right? And so some people already know this information. If you've been in the park system, or if you've done a lot of hiking or backpacking, you already know this information. But as a new backpacker, this may be somewhat new to you. So the first and most obvious is probably just the national parks. And this is operated by the US National Park System. Some examples are Big Bend National Park, Yosemite, Yellowstone. All of those are national parks. And I think almost all those you can backpack in. The second location that you might consider are state parks. And so in Texas, you might actually be even more familiar with the state parks, because we only have, I think, 2 national parks in Texas, out in West Texas, but we have state parks spread out throughout the state, and they're actually more accessible. These are operated by Texas Parks and Wildlife, and some examples are Colorado Bend and Lost Maples, but there are a number of other state parks where you can go backpacking. Another option are national forests, and these are operated by the U.S. Forest Service. And I believe that the U.S. Forest Service now falls under the Department of the Interior. So if you go to their website and it says Department of the Interior, you're in the right place. But some examples of this are Sam Houston National Forest and the LBJ grasslands, I think. And so what's the difference between national park and a national forest? In general, I think the main difference is that the national parks have a little bit more resources in terms of like facilities and like a store, ranger services. Sometimes the national forest has those, but sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's just a little kiosk that has a little information, but you're able to go out into the property. There's sometimes a parking lot, sometimes it's just a little pull off and you can park and you can backpack. Another location where you can go is land on the Bureau of Land, managed by the Bureau of Land Management. And oftentimes you'll hear this referred to as BLM land. And so some examples of that are the Chosa site out in New Mexico, out like north of Guadalupe Mountains National Park, or Goose Island in Utah. But these are pieces of land that are managed by the US government, but I would say they're even, there's probably even fewer facilities and resources on these pieces of land. Sometimes it's just raw land, but you can go out there, you can park your car and you can just hike. Sometimes there's trails, sometimes there's not trails, sometimes you have to make your own trails, but it's very raw land. But it's an option often. Another type of property is managed by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer. And we're pretty fortunate in the Austin area because we have one of those pieces of land very close to us up at Lake Georgetown. And if you didn't realize this, Lake Georgetown is actually the San Gabriel River. It's been dammed up. And so it created the lake. And then around the lake, the U.S. Corps of Engineers built a trail system. And it's actually free to use. You can just go out there, park your car at one of the parks. Some of the parks, they charge admission, they charge a fee, but some of them they do not. And then you can just start backpacking. And then of course, there's what we call a thru-hike. And a thru-hike is generally thought of as going from one point, or terminus, sometimes it's called a terminus, to another point or terminus, and it's hiking that full distance. Some people say it's like 100 miles. I don't know if there's a clear definition of that, anything over 100 miles, but it's generally done all at one time during a calendar year, I think is the official thing. And when you do a through hike, you may actually pass through all of these types of other park systems. You might start off in a national park, you might walk through a state park, you might go through a national forest. You may go through a number of different pieces of land depending on the distance that you're hiking. And then of course, there's always the international options, and sometimes we forget about these. But you can catch a flight and go to Costa Rica, and it could be a shorter flight than traveling up to Wyoming. It's only like, I think 2.5, 3 hours to Costa Rica from Texas. And so there's a number of international destinations, a lot of destinations in Europe and South America, Australia, just all over, even some hikes in Asia. But a lot of times we don't think about those options, but they're there. And some of them are really nice, really nice. So what are some resources that we wanted to share with you in terms of where to help you decide where to go? The first one is just your friends. Ask around with your friends, ask where they've gone, where they're planning to go, get information from them. Now, some of us don't have a lot of friends that, into the outdoors or into backpacking. And so you need to kind of find that your tribe of backpackers, your community. And one way to do that is through Meetup. Of course, this is the Austin Backpackers Group. Show up to one of our socials, just start talking with people, find out where they're going, where they've been, you know, ask them questions, get information from them, and then you can decide, you know, based on that. Another good option is just Facebook groups. And let's see, so I actually, I missed some of these, let's see. Anyway, this is the National Parks website. This is the Texas State Parks and Texas Parks and Wildlife website. But another option, a resource where you can find information about backpacking is just Facebook. And so if you just go up into the search menu and type backpacking or hiking, you'll come across all these different groups, backpacking and hiking groups, backpacking for beginners, ultralight backpacking. And then they also have, you know, sometimes there's regional groups or state groups. There might be backpacking for Texas or California or specific trails, John Muir Trail, Appalachian Trail. But there's a forum just about for any trail that you can imagine. But just if you're on Facebook, it's a good resource to just learn about the trail and kind of network with people. Let's see. Yeah, and then I did want to point out that on this checklist, all these links are live, whether you're looking at the Google Doc or the PDF, so you can click on it and it'll take you to these links. The other resource that I look at sometimes is just Instagram. And so this is my personal Instagram. Oh, I already had it in here. But if you just do hashtag backpacking, it'll, you know, basically show you pictures. And so it'll just give you an idea of like some really, you know, some of them are a little bit like pose, of course, but there's some really awesome ones like, oh, look, let's look at this one. Where is this? And so you click on it and it's a Grand Teton National Park, right? So that's awesome. And then you might say, oh, where is this? I'd like to go to this place. And you click on it and it's Iguazu Falls. You know, that's in Brazil and Paraguay and Argentina. It's right at that corner of those. But sometimes if you just want inspiration or you're looking for like a beautiful place to go, just go to Instagram and hashtag backpacking and you'll just be exposed to a lot of places that you might not have considered. So it's just another option. Let's see. And then, oh yeah, this side, the magazine, Backpacker Magazine, they have a website and they have a link to this area called trips. And for the trips, they have it categorized into different areas: adventure travel, long trails, which are like the Appalachian Trail, the Pacific Crest Trail, Continental Divide Trail, trips by national park, or trips by state. And so like, just real quick, I'm just going to click on this one for trips by state. And we'll see how it goes. And so there, it lists, you know, all these different states. And let's go down to Texas because we're in Texas. Click on here. And then it'll give you some options of where you can hike in this great state of Texas. So there's hiking at Enchanted Rock, Colorado Bend State Park, this Lighthouse Rock, I think that's Paladura Canyon, and then Big Thicket National Preserve. But anyway, so the state option, you know, if you want to hike in California or Nevada, Utah, look at these options. I think it's a great resources just to get an idea of where you might want to go. The other one is by national park. So if you just click on the national park one, let's see, you know, it gives you these beautiful images and then you can choose a park, whichever one you might want to go to. If you have a checklist of national parks that you're trying to knock off, you know, it's awesome. But anyway, it's just a resource for you. The link is in this checklist right here. Just click on this link. It'll take you to the Backpacker Magazine website, and it has those categories. The other one that you might want to look at in deciding where to go is if you're a thru hiker, if you want to tackle one of the big 3 trails, the trek.com, click on that link and it'll take you to their website. And the Trek, it has, you know, a lot of information. It has resources about the different trails. It's mainly for thru hikers if you're going to do one of the big ones, the AT, the CDT, or the PCT. But I think they also cover some other smaller trails. But it not only has information about trails themselves, but about gear, about other resources, about like community, I think as well. But that's a good resources, the trek.co. And then let's see. And if you want more specific information about one of those big trails, the PCTAT or CDT, these are links to the associations that help manage and care for the trail. And then there's other apps, All Trails, Gaia GPS, and just Google Maps. Sometimes I'll just spend time on Google Maps and I'll look for green space, on Google Maps, and then I'll see, oh, what is that? I want to go there. So it depends on how adventurous you are. Let's see. So once you kind of decide where you might want to go, you have to kind of decide, do you want to go solo or in a group? And there's advantages to both, I think. When you go solo, you have a lot of autonomy. You can just go on your own schedule, where you want to go. You can choose your own trail, your own time commitment, and you can explore your personal interests, whether it's hiking long distances or whether it's photography or whether it's, seeing animals or finding artifacts or anything like that. Sometimes it's easier to go by yourself because you're the only one that you're relying on. You just have to have the gear and the initiative and you can go. You can set your own schedule. And sometimes the costs can be more or less expensive. When you go by yourself, of course, like you might have to pay for your own park pass, your own permit. What are some other things? Your own transportation. But sometimes it can be less expensive too if you're really good at managing your own budget. And I think the thing about going solo backpacking is it is very rewarding. I don't know. When I've done it, I've just always have felt a sense of accomplishment. And I think that part of it also is I also find it very enjoyable because I get to focus on my personal interests. I don't have to follow the group. Now, there are advantages to going in a group as well. Advantages and disadvantages, I should say. There is a reliance on the group. So you have to rely on other people to determine where you're going and when you're going and so forth. But one of the advantages are that you can learn about new interests, right? So maybe you've just been always a point A to point B type hiker, but somebody in your group knows quite a lot about flora and fauna or knows about history. And so that's something that I really enjoy hiking with other people is learning from their experience. The other thing is that it does require a higher degree of coordination, both in terms of like the trails that you select, but the timing, sometimes even gear, sometimes transportation, definitely all that. It requires much more coordination. We're going to get into some tools for that a little bit later. You have to be able to work on your consensus schedule. So everybody has to agree, what the schedule is and pretty much starting and finishing and getting home and all that. It has to be somewhat of a consensus. And so you have to sometimes sacrifice your own personal schedule to meet the consensus schedule. But sometimes it is more cost effective because, if you're traveling in a group, you may be able to all get in on the same park pass if somebody has a park pass. So that right there could save you a lot of money. If you're carpooling, you can save money on gas or so forth. If you have to stay at a hotel before or after your trip, you can save money by going in a group. And then there's other things, but sometimes it also can be more expensive. If you go if you're kind of a budget backpacker and you like to take buses or carpool or go really budget with your food. Some people like to stay at hotels, then have big meals beginning or ending, and so all those add up in terms of cost. So sometimes going in a group can be more expensive. Some of it is getting to know the group and the people and where you fit in. But I think it also is a lot of fun going in groups, and mainly because for me it's always fun, because you learn about these other people's interests and you learn from other people. And you learn about their gear and you learn about, different ways of, I don't know, cooking or filtering water, or you learn a lot. I learn a lot. And sometimes you learn who snores and who doesn't snore, but it's all part of the process. Now, some resources as you're planning, whether you're going solo or group, or the ones that I like to use, Google Docs. This, what you're seeing before you is a Google Doc. So you can use this form and you can, put all your trip information into a Google Doc, and then it's very easy to share, right? So, and you can always update it and change it to the needs of the trip. And so I think Google Docs is just an invaluable tool. Also, I think I'm going to discuss this a little bit later, but if you are going solo, you can share your Google Doc with other people so they know your itinerary and your schedule, and that's important. I'll cover that later. Google Sheets is also a valuable tool if you want to. Some people are very, very comfortable using Google Sheets. I think Maya is like the queen of Google Sheets, but you can plan route information, you can plan hiking distances, water supply distances, checklists, like this one. You could put this into a Google Sheet checklist. And then financials, if you're going in a group, you can do a budget in there and everybody can be aware of the budget, and you can divide up costs and so forth. So Google Sheets is a good option too. Google Calendar just helps you to share your calendar and make sure everybody's on the same page in terms of when you're going and the time frames and things like that. Now, the traditional method of doing all this was in a pre-trip planning meeting. And so you might meet at a pub and you might discuss all these items, and then everybody's, is informed. But, sometimes that's not always possible if you're doing it with somebody, in another city or another state or another country. If you plan your travels, and sometimes even just being in the same city, it's hard to get everybody together at the same time. Thankfully we have Zoom now, so Zoom is another way of conducting those pre-trip planning meetings. And then so the next thing, once you've kind of decided where you might want to go and who you're going with, you got to start looking. You want to start considering what I'm calling camping options. And so this is kind of maybe basic for some of you that have more intermediate or advanced experience, but the different type of camping. So probably most people are familiar with established campsites where it's at a park. You drive to the park, you enter the park, you probably made a reservation and you pull up to your campsite. There's a parking spot right by your campsite, and so you set up your tent right there on a pad. So that's what I'm considering like established campsites. There's different degrees of it. Sometimes you park separately and you hike into your campsite, but it's more or less the ones that you're probably all very familiar with. Now, if you're new to backpacking, you might have heard of this term dispersed or primitive campsites. And these are really the sites that most backpackers try to reach. These are sites that are usually back further into the wilderness, and you have to hike to them. You cannot drive to them. Sometimes you can take a boat or a kayak or something like that. But so these are what we call dispersed or primitive campsites. And even at these dispersed and primitive campsites, sometimes there's a designation of where they are. There might just be a sign, or there might be actually like a hard packed area of dirt or rocks or logs laid out, and that that's a designated primitive campsite. Sometimes there's not a designation. There's not a designation, but oftentimes there is, because it kind of goes in sync with leave no trace and camping on a hard packed surface so that the natural flora doesn't get trampled. But there is also another type of camping option called zone campsites. And these would fall under, dispersed campsites, but it's just a big area. So the area could be the size of a football field. It could be the size of a neighborhood, but it's an area where you can camp. And so once you hike into that general zone, you can camp anywhere in that zone. So, you don't have to camp right next to somebody. You can keep hiking once you're in the zone, as long as you're in the zone. And so there's campsites like that. And then for thru-hike campsites, once again, like on a thru-hike, you might go through all three of these or more different types. So you might start off in an established campsite and stage there. And then as you hike in, you'll stay at a dispersed campsite. And then you hike in further, and there might be a zone campsite. And then you hike in further, and you might come up into another campground where you stay at established campsite. So it's just day after day, it could be different, but you could be staying at any of these options on a thru-hike. Something else about camping that you need to consider is if you need a backcountry permit. And for most national parks and state parks, I would say that you do need what they call a backcountry permit. And you can oftentimes reserve those online at the website. But sometimes it is first come, first served, which means you just have to show up to the ranger station. And basically you should already have your itinerary planned, and you present your itinerary and you say, I would like to hike to this area and I'd like to get a backcountry permit. And we're going to hike here and then here and then here, and then we're going to come back, so forth. But sometimes it's just based on a first come, first served basis, whether you get, when you get that backcountry permit. And then sometimes there's what's known as a lottery. And for some of the really popular hikes, like the, I don't know, like the John Muir Trail, I'm not sure what other ones have, some of the trails in the Pacific Northwest, they have a lottery system where I think like 6 months out, you have to submit your itinerary on a website, and then they do a drawing, and then they issue a limited amount of backcountry permits because they want to limit the number of hikers. It's actually, think of it as a good thing, because they're trying to limit the number of hikers so that you're not surrounded by a crowd of hikers, so that you have kind of a awesome wilderness experience. So lotteries are sometimes a pain, but they're also a pleasure, in that they help lessen the amount of people that should be on the trail at any given time, and also the amount of damage that can be done on a trail at any given time. Because I don't know, maybe you've come across where there's a huge group of 30 Boy Scouts that just happen upon your camping area, and sometimes it's not the most pleasant thing. God bless the Boy Scouts, I love them. I was a Cub Scout myself, but it is, I think the permitting system is of benefit to all of us as backpackers. But check in to see if you need a backcountry permit when you go into certain lands. Usually national parks and state parks you do. National forests, BML land, U.S. Army Corps of Engineer land, you generally don't. And then you also need to factor in reservation. So is a reservation required where you're going backpacking? Sometimes it is. Sometimes, once again, it's on a first come, first served basis. So you have to get out there and reserve the site. Like Guadalupe Mountains in West Texas, it used to all be first come, first served. So you're driving 8-9 hours and you're trying to get a permit. Most people, what would they do is they drive and then they stage the night before, and they'd go early in the morning to reserve the permit that they want and the campsites that they want. But you just need to research that to see what the rules are, whether you can reserve it, or if it's first come, first serve. Reserve on arrival, that's kind of the same thing. And then some other considerations when you're looking at your campsites is, are there parking spaces? So of course at these established campsites, there's usually parking spaces, but let's say if you're doing a trail that is not around the established campsites, sometimes you're just pulling onto the side of the road. Sometimes there's a parking lot. Sometimes there's no parking. You have to be dropped off. Oh, yes, you guys follow the chat on the side. There's a lot of people that are getting good information there. But so you need to understand, if you are driving, are there parking spaces at the trailhead? Sometimes you might have to take a shuttle, or you have to get somebody to drop you off. And also, are there parking spaces where you have to reserve or pay a fee? So a number of years ago, I hiked the John Muir Trail. And so you can leave your car at the beginning or at the end. I chose to leave it at the end. And there's the city government has a lot where you can just pay to leave your car, and it's known that it's for hikers and it's safe, and you just pay a fee basically for, can't remember, it's by the week or something like that, by the day. But it was reasonable because they're trying to encourage hiking. But you just want to be aware. Sometimes you just don't want to leave it on the side of the road. It's a little nerve-wracking, just leave it on the side of the road in some barren land, but sometimes you have to do that. And then campsite locations, what was this about? Okay, so once you kind of figure out what your camping options are. You know, it could be any of these campsites, established, dispersed, zone. You kind of want to lay it out, get a hold of a good map where it's a physical map or a digital map, and you want to lay out your campsites on your map, and then that'll be the beginning of how you estimate, you know, the trail distance and things that the distances that you'll be hiking. I think that's the point on that. And then fire safety course required. So this is something that is definitely more prevalent out west, but I wouldn't doubt if it's, you know, eventually starts happening in more places. But when you're hiking, especially in California, a lot of times they require that you take a little fire safety course. And it's really, I think it's just like a 5 or 10 minute video with a quiz at the end. And then once you complete that, it's just about fire awareness, what stoves are allowed, when fires are allowed, when they're not allowed, and then some precautions to take, things like that. It's good information. It's just a little administrative thing you have to do. But again, it's like the permits. It's good for all of us because nobody really wants to backpack into the area where there's forest fires. And if we can all do our part, it's a good thing. So just check and see if it's required to have a fire safety course. They give you actually a little certificate. You can print out a certificate and you have to carry it with you when you're hiking. The same thing with the backcountry permit. You should always, once you get it, you should print it out and carry it with you, because there will often be rangers on the trail that check for your backcountry permit and sometimes your fire safety course permit. Let's see. Yeah, so be sure to follow the chat. Some people are making some good comments there. Now, of course, some of the resources for finding campsites, the nps.gov, that's the National Park System's website. It has all the information about the national parks, and it usually has a link to recreation.gov, which is the reservation system. And so they have this separate entity that handles kind of like the reservations and the financial transactions. You can usually get to it from the NPS site. But sometimes you might have just come across it and you wondered, well, what sites can I reserve on recreation.gov? It's generally national park systems. Likewise, Texas Parks and Wildlife, they have a website, and their reservation system is reserveamerica.org. But you can get to it from the Texas Parks and Wildlife website. Reserveamerica.org also manages it for a number of other states. So if you're going to some other states, you can kind of browse around on that website and see. It's not just for Texas state parks, but they do handle Texas state parks. Something else that you might need to look at is a website called thedirt.com, and they have a search engine for national parks, state parks, and private campgrounds. And I say this because sometimes you're not able to get, like you have to stage before you start backpacking, and you might have to stay outside of the national park because you can't get a campsite within the national park or state park. And so you have to go to a private campground. And this website lists a lot of private campgrounds. So you just search for the area, and you might be able to find one close to the park or the area that you're going to go backpacking in. It's just an option. Another one is HipCamp for private campgrounds. And then iOverlander is really a website designed and created for vehicle camping. But again, sometimes if you want to stage before you go into the park or before you go into the wilderness, you can look for spots to camp on iOverlander. Okay. Okay, so the next thing we want to talk about is route planning. And so this is probably one of the more interesting parts about trip planning is route planning. And some people spend hours doing this. I think Maya spends hours mastering her trip plans and putting it all in spreadsheets. But when you're first trying to figure out your route planning, think about a little bit about the target destination or objective. And so some people have the objective or the target of they want to go from one end to the other, one terminus to the other terminus. Sometimes you want to go to see a summit of a mountain or a waterfall or a lake, or a geographical feature or architectural feature. Sometimes you just want to hike. Some people just enjoy hiking and just seeing it all, but it's just something to consider, like, do you have an objective? And I make a point of this because sometimes it's good if you're going with a group, if you have similar objectives, because some people just want to go point A to point B as fast as they can, as long as they can, while some people want to stop and see the waterfalls or stop and see nature. And so if you're out of sync on that, sometimes it can create a little conflict or difficulty. So sometimes it's good to be very clear when you're planning as a group, what is the target destination or what is the objective, okay, when you're planning your route. This is just a little insight into daily hiking distances when you're trying to figure out, well, how far can I hike? There is the distance itself. You need to factor in, are there any side trips that I want to take? Like, is there a waterfall that I want to go check out? Or is there a lake that I need to get water from? I might have to hike a mile or two off trail to get that water. Let's see. Oh, I went a little out of order. Personal ability. So distance is one thing. Personal ability, like how much are you accustomed to hiking? What is your personal ability to hike? You need to factor in your pack weight. If you're going light or if you're carrying a lot of food and water, that will affect your hiking distance. The weather, of course, if it's a muddy trail, if it's raining a lot, the weather might influence you. Or if it's cold, sometimes it's cold or snowy. The topography will influence your hiking distance. So if you're covering a lot of different topography elements, elevation, and by that I mean like altitude. If you're hiking at altitude, you're probably not going to be able to hike as much or as long, just because you need more oxygen and it's more tiring. Sometimes the terrain, and by that I mean, are there rocks? Is it swampy? Are you crossing a lot of creeks, that type of thing? So those all factor into your distance. Kind of like, I've mentioned this before, but just like if you're a person that stops and likes to take photographs, that might matter in terms of how you factor in your hiking distance. If you're taking side trips, injuries. So this comes into two factors. Do you have any what do you call it, preconditions or injuries, or do other people in your group have injuries that you need to factor in? And then also you might want to factor in, well, what happens if somebody does get injured on your trail? How do you respond to that? And so if somebody maybe is a little, you start hiking and they're a little bit bumbling, like me, sometimes I'm bumbling, you might want to maybe cut back your distances. And then I actually sometimes factor in getting lost, because I kind of believe in planning out 80% of it and then leaving 20% for just whatever happens, adventure. And so I sometimes allocate time for getting lost. If I want to go explore something, getting lost. That's why I call it getting lost. Just as general guidelines, beginner hikers can usually handle 3 to 6 miles of backpacking. Occasional backpackers can often increase their distances to 7 or 8 miles. And then experienced backpackers often tackle 10 miles plus 20 miles a day. But again, it's important as you're laying out your route to understand the group you're going with and what their capabilities are. And it's good if you can all be kind of in the same area, in the same kind of mindset. But if not, at least have an understanding that there might be a faster group and a slower group, and that you'll meet up, during the day or at the end of the day. That just needs to be communicated when you're figuring out the route. Water resupply is, a pretty important part of route planning. And I would say it's even one of the more limiting factors other than campsites, because you need water to survive. I think something like 3 days, you can survive without water for 3 days, but it's not a comfortable thing. So water resupply is always an important thing. And the 3 things that you need to look at is there water at the trailhead that you can stock up on? Is there water en route, or is there water at your campsite? If it's at all 3, that's awesome, but oftentimes it's not. And if it's at none of those 3, it means that you have to basically bring your water from home or stop off at a store and pick up all your water before you get to the trailhead. But those are just the factors that you need to consider where on the trail you're gonna be able to find it. And I always think it's valuable to triangulate your information. And by that, I mean, a triangle has 3 points. So get at least 3 sources of information. And so you can look at books, you can look at maps to determine where water sources are, more and more websites and apps, and sometimes forums. Like if you're going to a certain area that's known for being dry or seasonal water, you can go to the forums and you can ask people, hey, has anybody come back from this area recently? Is there water, at this spring or that spring? You usually want to be kind of specific and note and let them know that you've done some research, but you're just looking for the most current information. And then also ranger stations. So, whenever you start your hike, if there's a ranger station available, it's always valuable to just go in there and discuss your plan with them and just ask, hey, is there a water source here? Or is this spring running? And then the other source that is also very valuable is hikers. And it's usually hikers that are coming from the opposite direction as you're walking. So people that are coming towards you, they're often coming from the direction that you're going. So you just strike up a conversation and you say, hey, was there water at the last campsite that you stayed at? Or was there water along the way? Or, and so you can get that information. And that's probably the most up-to-date information you can get. But I always like to triangulate my information. I don't like to just ask one person and rely on them. I like to get it from multiple sources. I'm just reading the comments a little bit. Yeah. Yeah. Okay, good. Let's see. Water. So kind of along the same lines, you just need to understand about water purification. If you are going to be able to source it from a potable faucet, if you're going to have to filter it or chemical treat it or boil it. And sometimes, it might be that you carry a filter. I think almost all backpackers carry a filter, but sometimes it's not always in your best interest. If it's really murky, maybe it's better to chemically treat it or boil it because you want to save your filter, right? You don't want to clog up your filter, and you could boil your water, and it might be better to save your water to where it's clear. And so also when you're doing this route planning, you need, just like how you plot out your campsite, you want to plot out your water sources on the map, then you measure the distances and you plan accordingly. And just some tips, I always like to camel up, which means drinking a liter all at one time. And I usually do that at the beginning of my hike. And then whenever I come up to a water source, I like to camel up and drink as much water as I can, because for me, I don't know if it makes sense, if it's science-based, but it always feels easier to carry water in my stomach than in a bottle on my back. So camel up. Sometimes you might need to stash water along the route. So if you're hiking on a long trail, you might just have to drive somewhere along the route and stash your water in a location that you can find it again. And generally you want to mark it with the GPS. Under normal conditions, I think people recommend a minimum of 1 liter every 4 miles, plus maybe 1 liter for meal time. So at meal times, if you have backpacker food that you need to rehydrate, you'll also want some water to drink. So 1 liter under normal conditions for hiking, and then 1 liter for meal times. Under dry conditions, you need to up that. So you might need a minimum of 2 liters for every 4 miles, and then 1 liter for meal times. And then altitude, the same thing. If you're hiking at elevation, at altitude, you might need to carry 2 liters every 4 miles, and then 1 liter for meal times. And if you're hiking in dry altitude conditions, you might need to bump it up. So it might be 3 liters or 4 liters for every 4 miles. 4 liters is probably a lot, but you might need 3 liters in dry, high altitude situations, because you do get dehydrated much quicker. Yeah, okay, great. Let's see. And then food resupply, just here, sometimes if you're just going for like a weekend trip, a 2 or 3 day trip, you just usually package all your food and you bring it all at one time. But if you're going on a longer hike, sometimes you might need to look at these resources like grocery stores, convenience stores, restaurants, hotels, where you can just buy a meal basically, or replenish your supply. It might not be like at a grocery store, you're usually going to be able to find a lot of good food. Convenience stores, sometimes it's limited. It might not be the most nutritious food or what you love, but it's food. And sometimes all you need is those calories. And rather than carrying 10 days of food, it might be better, more beneficial just to stop off after 5 days and resupply at a local source to resupply your food. And for people that through hike, sometimes you even prepare your packages beforehand and send it to a post office or a courier office or a hotel, sometimes at different places where you can pick up your meal supplies. And just in general for food, most people think of 3 meals per day plus 2 snacks. This link is just a link to, I think it's called Green Belly. It's a website. They actually provide backpacker meals, but they have like just a lot of good suggestions that you can make your own meals. So check that out. And then this is another tool. So for a weekend trip, they say that you need about 3,000 calories. For a through hike, you might need 5,000 calories a day. If you're really concerned about it, there's this calculator at Green Belly. Let me see, I think I have this over here. Yeah, so they provide this calculator where you can put in your body weight, pack weight, average pace, and then it kind of gives you what your calorie intake should be. So it's just kind of a neat tool. To be very honest, I really don't use it. I just pack food, but I'm almost always coming back home with more food, and so I'm not the best at planning food. I just pack for what I need to eat. But if you want to get really into it, it might be worth it to use a calculator. And then emergency meals, this is kind of debatable whether you want to do this. I generally take at least one like Pro Bar or Power Bar as an emergency meal, just in case like my food, something happens to my food, or I'm out later than I need to be. If I'm going into an area that is really remote, that I'm unfamiliar with, I might take a full day's worth of emergency meals, so like 3 meals, just in case something happens where we can't do the distance that we need to do, or something happens like an animal eats some of my food, or it's just an emergency. I think you guys understand that. So it's something to consider. Some people don't bother with that because, again, I think you can last 3 weeks without eating and not die, but it's not going to be comfortable. So I generally like to have a little bit of an emergency meal. The other thing that you want to consider when you're route planning is just transportation. And this is researching the trailhead and how to get there. And there's generally, I think these are like the 3 or 4 types of trails that you need to be aware of. So an out and back is basically you start at one point, you hike out, and then you come back along the same trail to where you started. That's the most simple. The second one would be considered a loop hike, where you just hike, and then exactly what it sounds like, you go on a loop and you end up back at this place where you started. And then those are the easiest to plan for, because your transportation, you just need one spot where your transportation is starting or where you're beginning. A through hike is usually one terminus to the other terminus. So you're hiking, so you need transportation to get to your beginning and to your end. And sometimes you plan that out. Sometimes it's somebody picking you up or dropping you off. Sometimes it's a shuttle, but there's different, you need to know what type of hike you're planning. And there's the hike called a flip-flop, where you might start in the middle, hike one distance, and then flip-flop back to the other side, get transportation, and then hike back to where your car is. I think there's different types of flip-flops, but it's basically you're cutting up your trip into different segments, and you plan your transportation accordingly. We're running a little bit late on this, later than I was hoping, but I'm going to try to wrap it up quickly, this segment of it. And then seasonal openings and closings, you need to be aware of this when you're researching your transportation. For example, I believe in Yosemite, at certain times of the year, they start closing roads because they're impassable during the winter. And so if you're hiking on the winter or on the shoulder seasons, you need to know when those roads start closing down. Sometimes the resources that support those roads, ranger stations, cafes, restaurants, those close down. So when you're factoring in your transportation, just look at seasonal openings and closings to know what you're getting into. Staging vehicles, I talked a little bit about that, but that's basically where you might, if you're driving, you might either put your vehicle at the beginning or at the end. I typically like to put it at the end so that once I reach the end, I just hop in my car and I'm going. It's kind of, some people, sometimes you can't do that. So you might have your vehicle at the beginning. Once you get to the end, you have to figure out how to get back to the beginning. And it might be a shuttle, it might be that you've prearranged, or it might be hitchhiking or something like that. But you just need to figure this in your transportation if you do need to stage vehicles. Sometimes you can look at shuttle services, car services. It can save you a lot of time, definitely, and convenience. It does cost money sometimes, but sometimes it's well worth it. So factor that in. And sometimes it's better than leaving a car at the trailhead, is to have a shuttle service take you there. It's kind of super convenient, right? I actually like that a lot. And so sometimes, in some areas, like none of these things exist. So you just have to get a friendly drop off where somebody agrees to take you to the location and pick you up. That's awesome. If you can arrange that, that's awesome. And then hitchhiking is also an option. It's not real common, I would say, in Texas, but in some of the other areas like Utah and California, and maybe in the Pacific Northwest, near a lot of these parks, you just hold up a sign and people will pick you up. They see you have a backpack on, they're backpackers, and they'll take you where you need to go. Sometimes your best option is like when you're getting towards the end of a trail, if you run into day hikers and you need a ride, just start talking to people, say, hey, how's your hike been going? And they say, oh, we just came out for the day. And then say, hey, are you going back into the town? Can you give me a ride? And that's a great way to find a hitchhike ride, because they're usually friendly hikers. And if you've been on an extended backpacking trip, a lot of times, and then they're just out for a day hike, they're like, yeah, that'd be awesome. I'd love, they want to hear about your experience. So it's just an option. You do need to be careful or take precautions. And I think, unfortunately, during COVID, people are a little bit more precautious about that, but it's an option anyway. Let's see. So some of the resources for this are park maps. And I just wanted to bring this as an example. I don't know, let's see, this is one to Guadalupe Mountains. So these are usually available free at the park, but you need to be careful about using this, because while it is a trail map, it doesn't have the detail that you'll often need for backpacking. And so I don't recommend relying on this as your only source of navigation. Much better are National Geographic maps. If you want to start using, digital tools like Google Maps, All Trails, Gaia GPS, CalTopo, MyTopo, all of these are very good. Far Out Guides, formerly Gut Hooks, is a well-known app for thru-hikers, and it's awesome. It has so much more information, just trail information. It has water spots, people update it with information. It's just awesome. If you're doing a thru-hike, highly recommend it. Onyx Map is kind of a new kid on the block. They're focused a lot on vehicle camping, but they're developing backpacking resources, so keep an eye on them. And then the trek.co, I already showed you that. So we're getting kind of close towards the end, but destination planning, when you're trying to figure out, you already know you're gonna go hike, you're backpacking, and you kind of know your destination, you want to start looking at these factors. So climate and weather, and you need to monitor both the averages. So let's say I'm going to backpack in May in Yosemite. I want to look on the website and see what the averages temperatures are in May during the time that I'm going. You can go to a number of different sources. NOAA is a good weather source where you can get averages, and you usually want to add 10 degrees, the high and the low. You need to be ready for that when you backpack. You might even say like 15 degrees. So if it's like, oh, it's going to be 70 to 40, you might want to consider that it's going to be 85 to 25. So you need to not only plan for that average, you need to plan for the outliers, because more than likely it's going to happen when you're backpacking. So you look at the averages when you're planning, but then you also start looking at current conditions. And I generally look at current conditions about a week in advance. I start looking at it, and then maybe like two days ahead, 1 day ahead, and then the morning or the day that I'm leaving. So I like to look at it, a week out, just to get a rough estimate and see what's coming. But then I always look right before the trip. And this is a resource. NOAA is a good weather source. There might be other ones. If you guys have ones that you particularly like, go ahead and list it in the chat. And then it's mainly just packing appropriately for the climate and the weather, the layers, your rain gear, tarp, You can also utilize natural cover. And it's not too often that people carry tarps now backpacking unless you're hammock camping. But sometimes it's just nice, a tarp, you can set it up, in the middle of the day and have shade, or when it's rainy, you can set it up and people can get below it. It's not too common anymore, but that's what people used to do all the time. And then natural cover, I mean, once you get more in depth into backpacking, you might learn to look for this. And so when you're plotting your route, you look for, where there's forest. You want to look for where there's peaks and where there's saddles of mountains, because you don't generally want to be on the peaks or mountains when the weather system's passing through. And especially out west, a lot of times it seems like the weather systems it's almost like clockwork. They come through at 3 o'clock. And so you really want to have most of your hiking done before that time, or you don't want to be on those naturally exposed areas. You want to be lower, or you want to be in the forest, or, I mean, when you're hiking out in Utah too, you can also factor in that where the sun is, and you can hike along routes where there's shade. So that's something that, if you get more advanced, you can try to look at these things. When you're just starting out, you just need to get out and do it. But as you get more advanced, you can look for some of these items. Proper food storage, basically just research the rules, learn and practice the methods of storing your food. The most common methods, there's food lockers, there are, metal containers where you put your food in. As soon as you get to your camp, you put your food there, and then after you finish cooking, you put it in there. That's the most common. Canisters or bear sacks or rodent sacks. You buy these, and they're often convenient. Sometimes they're required. So you put all your food, anything that smells, actually, toothpaste, if you're carrying deodorant, things like that, insect repellent, you put it all in there, your cookware sometimes, and you set it away from your camp. And that's to help prevent, animals from coming into your camp and get accustomed to coming into your camp. The other method, the food hang, where you throw a bag, you attach a bag to a string, throw it over a tree, hangs up out of the reach of animals. And then there's this thing called scent-proof bags. Some people use these. I actually use them. You can buy them, at REI. And then I believe there's somebody in our group that uses like these turkey basting bags. I don't know if you want to out yourself, but there's rumors that a turkey basting bag does the same thing as these scent-proof bags, and you just put your food there, you wrap it up, and then you sleep on it, I guess. So, but it's an option. Just wanted to put that out there. I still have my ones I bought, but I might go to a turkey basting bag at some point. Insects, you can plan for them. I generally don't worry about it too much. You can research pests. I generally rely on my clothing. So having a nice shell, like a rain shell, is also awesome for protecting you from insects. Maybe having a head net, if you're going in certain areas, you definitely want a head net. Having proper clothing like long pants or rain pants. Those are generally the methods that I use for insect protection. And then I'll also treat my clothing with a repellent ahead of time so that I don't have to carry anything. And so when you talk about repellents, a lot of backpackers use what they call permethrin, which is you treat your clothes ahead of time, stays in your clothes, and when an insect makes contact, it kills them. Okay. And so, but it's not something that you spray on your skin. You spray it on your clothes, you let it dry, and it lasts for weeks or washings. I don't know. There's, different theories about how long, but you got to look into that. There's another insect repellent called picaridin, which is a lotion or a liquid that you use just like normal insect repellent. That's a good one. It's less toxic than DEET. So DEET is one that everybody's familiar with, but DEET will deteriorate your clothing or your nylon or your gear. So you have to be very careful with DEET. You don't want to get it in contact with your tent or some of your really nice gear because it will deteriorate it. Some people go with natural, natural repellents, eucalyptus stuff. Some people have tried these sonic things that make us emit a sound. There's clip-on repellents. And then some people use diet. This is not DEET, this is diet. Some people will eat garlic or certain herbs to protect themselves from insects. I generally don't go with any of these. I usually use permethrin or picaridin, and or DEET if it's really bad and you need to be protected. I'll go with DEET. But those are just options. The other thing that you need to factor in with insects is just location. So insects like mosquitoes, they rely on water. So if you're camping near water, there's going to be more abundance of insects. If you're camping away from them in the desert, there's probably going to be less. Something else is like wind. So if you're at the top, if you've ever been to the beach and where it's windy, there's not insects. But if you go like closer to the dunes where the wind is being broken, you might get eaten up by mosquitoes. Just the difference of the dunes versus the open beach. It's the same thing in the wilderness. It could the same thing on the wind helps move the insects along or prevents them from settling. It's the same thing in the mountains. Elevation, as you go higher up in the mountain, there's generally fewer insects to worry about. And then temperature, once the temperature drops, I'd say like below 50, sometimes 40, there's generally fewer insects that you need to worry about. I don't worry about insects too much. I just rely on clothing for the most part. Wildlife, I really don't worry too much about wildlife. I love to see it. I love to interact with it at a distance. Go to this link, NPS, the National Park System government link about wildlife, health, and safety. Read up on it, educate yourself, and then hopefully you can enjoy it and not worry about it. All right, folks, so we're at a little bit about an hour, and it's time to pack. And I'm not really going to get into packing. This is not a workshop about packing, but our packing list, and these are links to REI. They have a traditional backpacking list, and they have an ultralight backpacking list, and you can go to those. And then they have a link for 10 essentials. And I just put this in here because generally when you're backpacking, you have all the 10 essentials with you. You have those things that you need to survive in the wilderness. But where backpackers often forget this is when they go for a day hike or excursion, they might set their backpack down and they might just take an energy bar. I'm just gonna be gone it's just a mile away, or it's just a short little trip, and they don't bring their 10 essentials. They don't bring water or food. I like to bring a little bag that I can carry all that in. And I like to travel with my 10 essentials. It's up to you. I'm not going to judge you if you don't, but I've been in situations where I needed a flashlight, or I ran out of water just on a short day excursion, or I needed navigation. So those things, you just need to take that into consideration. When you're packing, don't forget, if you want, you bring sleepwear. Sometimes it's nice to have just a clean set of clothing, thin, that that you always know is clean, that can also provide a little insulation. It's good to do it. Sometimes I just pack it in my sleeping bag and I just forget about it. And whenever I'm going to sleep, I have my sleepwear right there. Pack the appropriate weather wear. Food and snacks is your fuel, so you need that. And then emergency gear is kind of maybe a little bit debatable for some people. I think almost everybody carries a little bit of a medical kit. I like to carry a medical kit, and a repair kit is like for things to repair your kit, your gear. So like maybe some duct tape or gear aid tape. They have like little patches that helpful for patching tents, sleeping bags, down jackets, things like that. I always bring a little extra food. It depends on the type of hike that I'm doing on as far as how much. Sometimes I'll bring an extra light. I always have my cell phone, which is not the best extra light, but is an option. And then there's options like satellite locators, such as Garmin InReach, stormproof matches, water chemical purifiers. A lot of backpackers carry filters, but if your filter gets clogged, it's sometimes nice to just carry a few pills that you can drop in water to purify. Emergency blanket, that's debatable if you need that or not. Okay, but those are just some of the emergency gear items. You can click on the links, find out about them. This is the last little part of it, folks. Okay, so the final planning points, once you have all this information together, and if you are using like this checklist, the good thing is that you have a ability to share your itinerary with the group or your family or your friends. And so it's always good to share your schedule, your route, if you can, the campsites. If you're staying at certain accommodations before or after at the end of your trip, it's good to share. just as a point for people to check in on you, right? So even if you are just providing the hotel that you left from, it means that you have a point of contact. And if something happens, they can contact that hotel, and that hotel will hopefully have a record, say, yes, he was here on this day, they left together, so forth. But it's just a point of reference. Some people that use the tracking devices, you can share that with your family or friends. And then if there's the ability, it's always good to just to check in, right? You hit a cell signal, send somebody a text, I'm doing great, right? This is just kind of something kind of about the ethos of backpacking. So, respect the land, tread lightly, camp on durable surfaces. There's a whole lot more to that, but it's about preparing as you're going into wilderness to tread lightly and how you can do that. Leave no trace, research that yourself. And then cultural norms is something that I think it's become more and more, we're all becoming more and more aware of it, that there's certain historical and cultural sites in some of the places that we go backpacking. So we need to be respectful of that. No graffiti, don't leave trash, don't disrupt it, leave it as you find it. But it's also sometimes there's just some areas that you don't want to go to out of respect for the history or the culture, right? And there's also actually, an ethos with hiker trash, or like through hikers. So just click on that link. You'll have some fun with that. The last little bit I want to share is just international hiking or backpacking. I've done a bit of this myself, and I love it. I would want to do more of it in the future. The main thing you want to research about this is just like hiking in the United States. Think of it as that easy, but you might want to make the decision whether you want to pack it, buy it, or rent it. And so this could go for like your whole setup, your backpack, your tent, your sleeping bag, your poles. I know we're all attached to our gear, but sometimes it's just easier to buy it in the location or rent it. Sometimes it's just so much easier. Or if you're just traveling and you didn't plan to be in a spot that's in a great place to go backpacking, you can buy or rent there, and then it sometimes is worth it. I always like to carry on my backpack. My backpack is a 44-liter backpack, and when I take off the hood, it gets down to 40 liters, and 40 liters is I think what they call it, the minimum or the maximum legal carry-on size. So any of those roll-on luggages are about 40 liters. Now, if you go to Europe, it drops to about 35 liters, so you need to be aware of that. And on smaller airlines, it might be less than 40 liters. So be aware of that if you're taking like a little puddle jumping plane somewhere. So always check the regulations of the flights that you're taking, whether you can carry it on. I always like to carry it on. The only things that you cannot carry on or that you need to be aware of is like your utensils. So sometimes, like even if you have a fork, they might not let you carry on a metal fork. Sometimes they will. Definitely not knives. Even like multi-tools. Some multi-tools they won't let you carry on. I got stopped. I can't remember where it was. I think it was in Mexico or something like that. I was passing through, and I had a bicycle multi-tool, and they would not let me carry it on. So I had to check it in. It didn't have any blades or anything, but just because it was a tool, it would not let me carry it on. And I think a lot of airlines now are not allowing poles, so you need to figure out if you're gonna have to check these in. And what I generally do is I take one of those thick HEB bags, I put my poles in there, I wrap it up, and then I give it to my friend to check in their luggage. That's the way I do it. If you're going international, I do recommend travel insurance. These are some people that offer travel insurance. Just click on those links and find out which one meets your need. Now, immunizations, if you are traveling, if you're doing an international backpacking trip, it is likely that you're going to need some immunizations. You might have your measles, mumps, rubella, I think. That one's pretty common in the United States. The DT, I think that's called like diphtheria or something like that. The tetanus one, that's pretty common to have. Make sure that's up to date. Chicken pox. Hep A and B, often if you're traveling to some developing countries, you might need Hep A and B. And I forget which one, I think it might be B. It has to be done in a series. So you have to get one like a month before. I can't remember if it's a month or 3 months or something like that, but you have to get one, and then you have to get the follow-up shot a couple months after. And you need to have that before you go into the country. So factor that in if you're going international. Yellow fever, I mean, I've gotten all these at some point, but there's a lot of countries where you need to get yellow fever or typhoid. malaria, there's not a vaccine for malaria, but some countries require that you take the medicine or you get the medicine. And then of course, COVID, that's a whole new thing that we're all exposed to now. And there's all kinds of regulations behind that. We just factor that in. Well, this is just a website, cultural guide. If you are going international, I just found this while we were preparing this, but it's kind of cool because you can just go and you can search for different countries, and then they have these kind of cultural guides for each of these countries, just about cultural norms. It's just fun to read. So I thought I'd put that in. Filter versus purify versus bottled water. So this is something that you'll need to factor in. In the United States, we generally, as backpackers, we generally just filter our water. There are not the viruses that we have to prevent. It's usually mainly just the bacteria that, is that right? Yeah, the bacteria that we have to prevent. But when you go overseas, there's a lot of nasty viruses that you do not want. I lived in Guatemala for years. I've lived internationally for a few years, and I've taken some like I don't know what they call it, like international medicine courses where they teach you how to take care of yourself. And there's some things that you do not want to catch. And so if you're going outside of the United States, you might need to purify. Okay, that's a different type of filter, higher degree of purification. And then at some point, sometimes you might have that, but even the water might be contaminated by mines, like down in Chile or Bolivia, Peru. There's some areas where there's a lot of mining. And so the water, even if it's running, even if other people drink it, it can have like heavy metals in it. So you might just want to get bottled water and you just have to carry it. So just something to consider. Okay, that was a lot of information. I ran about 10 minutes over. Well, no, actually, yeah, a long time over. I was hoping this would only be 45 minutes, but hopefully you got some good information. Are there any questions that we need to cover, Victoria, that you saw in the chat come up, or?
Let's see. I didn't see any questions, but if anybody has any, then feel free to come off mute.
Questions. If you can throw them in the chat, and then we'll move into this next session where Victoria, I get to turn it over to Victoria, and she is actually going to plan a trip.